Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Radnor Memorial Library. My name is Pam Sidor. This event is a partnership with Radnor Historical Society, and Emily is here from Main Point Books if you'd like to purchase Ryan's book after Ryan's presentation. And tonight we have Abandoned or Forgotten, Overlooked Corners of Eastern Pennsylvania, and this is the new book by Ryan Stowinsky. And Ryan is here tonight. He's going to talk about this book that he's written and other books that he has written for History Press, Arcadia.
Middle Atlantic Press and Arcadia.
Middle Atlantic Press, okay. Well, tonight we welcome Ryan Stowinsky. The author and photographer has been visiting little-known historical sites, ghost towns, and other oddities in Pennsylvania and in several other states for nearly 2 decades. His writings and photographs have appeared in several books, newspapers, television shows, and websites. Ryan graduated from Misericordia University in Dallas, Pennsylvania, with a dual major in history and education. He currently resides in North Carolina with his wife and 2 daughters, where he teaches social studies. So please welcome Ryan Stowinsky to Radnor Memorial Library.
Good evening.
Good evening.
All right. So I think I would like to start with trying to answer the question, why? Why do this? The short answer is it's fun. Who doesn't go by an old building or an old historical site and be like, I wonder what's in there. I wonder why nobody goes there anymore. Why doesn't anybody pay attention to that? But it's not just that. There's a question, how did it end up like this? Why is nobody there anymore? What happened to this? So it all began a long, long time ago. I was walking in the woods with a friend and his dad, and there was this big factory in the woods, and from that moment I was hooked. But it wasn't just, ooh, it's creepy. What happened here? Why is this still standing? Why is nobody doing anything with this? What is its history? And in several instances, only a handful of people actually know the history of a specific place. One cemetery in particular, I am one of about 12 people who knows its location. So some of these, and it's in New Jersey, not here, so don't worry about it. And I can't tell you anyway. But one place in particular, one of the mine disasters in the Eastern Pennsylvania book, the newspapers in Luzerne County actually contacted me because everybody had forgotten where it was. I happened to find it by chance. I just used some detective work, some hints, and just there was a mine reclamation site down a particular road in this old town, and just through trial and error, I found it. And other people were asking, well, how did you get there? And because it was rediscovered, it now has a historical sign issued by the state since I've been there. I haven't yet seen the sign, but I did see pictures of it. So part of it is these people don't have anyone to speak for them. The World War II munitions town, or the munitions plant that took over a town in central eastern Pennsylvania known as Elvira. There's literally nothing left of it but a few walls of the old church and just property markers of the houses that were there. So a lot of these places don't have anyone to speak for them. A lot of them, the history is essentially lost other than through a few people who bothered to write it down. But if you go to the actual physical location, sometimes there is little to nothing left. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the other books and this book, how this all came to be. Back in 2007, I actually wrote my first book for Middle Atlantic Press, which is now defunct. They went out of business a few years ago. But I wrote Wandering Around South Jersey, and that came and went. Small regional book, did fairly well, and I figured that was the end of it. And then the History Press contacted me, and to be honest, at first I thought it was spam. I just got this random email, and I'm like, no way. Because at this point it had been 12 years. and I did my research, found out it was legit, and they asked about a book on Pennsylvania, which I actually started writing for Middle Atlantic Press, but then they announced that they were no more. So lucky for me, this one was pretty much done before I started, so that was helpful. Trouble is, I moved and started teaching in North Carolina a few years ago. So last year, during my spring break and summer vacation, I came back up north and I photographed all the New Jersey sites for the abandoned or forgotten overlooked corners of southern New Jersey. I actually worked on both books simultaneously. And then last year, just about a year ago from right now, the last week of May, first week of June, I went back and reshot all of the photos for the Eastern Pennsylvania book. And it was pretty surprising to see how much some of these sites had changed since I had lived here just a couple of years ago. And I did my best to do some comparisons with the places where I had higher quality photos. If you take a look in the book, especially at Concrete City, which is what the name says, it is a city made out of concrete entirely. It was built for railroad workers in Luzerne County in Nanticoke. And just a few years ago, the buildings were pristine for the most part, little bit of graffiti, not too much. And then now if you go there, now, that's redundant, the buildings are completely covered with graffiti. Vandalism is rampant. You can see somebody tried to set one of the buildings on fire. So it was interesting to compare the condition of them from just a few years ago to now. And I did that with a couple of sites in the book, as pictures permitted. Anybody have any questions so far? Yes, sir.
How much would you attribute what you just said to Instagram?
What do you mean?
Like the disseminating the knowledge of where it is, and the people getting together and going to that place to explore.
Is that Instagram? Like I said, did you say Instagram?
Yeah. So I see a lot of this on Instagram. I see a lot of hidden places on Instagram that weren't really well known, and now they're more out there than they used to be. I mean, I shouldn't blame Instagram entirely.
Well, one thing I've noticed, and not just here, but also in New Jersey too, especially in the Pine Barrens, the state is stepping in more and more, and sites that were once, within, state park or state forest property are now more and more off limits. Like there is a factory in particular where the trails went right past it. It was, you could go and check it out, but now they have closed that off. There's an old fire tower. So I think to an extent, these places are becoming more and more known, and certain people will freely give the directions. Personally, I didn't put any of this on things like Instagram until I went back and reshot the pictures. So it comes down to the individual themselves. Some people appreciate the history and some just see it as a party site. Unfortunately, I have noticed in the past, I would say 5 to 10 years especially, graffiti is becoming an issue. Another big thing that I've seen a lot of too, especially in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, is paintball. Concrete City that I mentioned earlier, there used to be like paintball arenas in the middle. People would garbage pick and put up trellises and things, and all the buildings were getting shot up. I don't really know if there's an answer to that. I mean, you could make them off limits. I mean, you can put up security, but I mean, they're abandoned, so it might just, it depends on the individuals. All right, any other questions? Yes.
So when you say that they're abandoned,
Yes, ma'am.
they don't belong to anybody?
Some are just sitting in the woods. Some can be in state parks, county parks. A lot of the sites that I've been to are like in a valley between mountains. Some are in state park grounds, some are on county park grounds. But they essentially are just sitting there and they're no longer in use. And this is very prevalent in the coal region in northeast Pennsylvania. There's a lot of abandoned mines. We've had mine disasters. Several of the sites that I visited were mine disasters. The mine caught fire or the mine collapsed. There's one in particular, and when we hear about these things, we think about the 1800s, industrial age. The most recent one that I went to happened in 1959. The coal company ordered the men to dig too close to the Susquehanna, and the river actually punched through and flooded the underground mines. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that Knox mine disaster was the end of mining in Wyoming Valley, and we're from Wilkes-Barre, by the way.
Okay. Whitehaven.
Yeah. So when that happened, it wasn't the original coal company that did that, but they were companies that went in after the original coal companies had finished operation, and they would go in and chip away at the columns that upheld the roots of the mine. They were called wildcatters then.
At that mine site, I didn't realize I had done this, but when I first visited it in 2009, I was only 2 or 3 days from the 50th anniversary of it. So there were several coins put on the monument. There's 2 different monuments. There's one for the people who lost their lives, and a little bit down the path, it's called the Eagle Air Shaft. There was a worker who actually led several of the people trapped underground through an old air shaft. The trouble was they didn't maintain it, so it was all plugged up and overgrown. So he literally dug himself out of the ground and went and got help. And I can't think of the name of the medal right now, but he did receive an award that year for rescuing, I believe it was 12 men from underground. So about a third of the workers got out because of this one worker.
Southern New Jersey book, are there any interesting spots you want to talk about that are anywhere near the shore, like Cape May?
Oh, Cape, I was actually just there yesterday. Cape May. If you like World War I and II, you'll like Cape May.
They have all those, well, they did have that underground thing where they stored munitions. Yeah, that's the word. Guns and all sorts of ammunition. That, when as a kid, I was able to walk in there. It was really fascinating. Most of the stuff was still there.
Oh, you mean the bunker?
Yes, the bunker.
Okay. There's a bunker on the beach in Cape May, just by the lighthouse. It actually used to be under the sand, but because of erosion, it is now above ground. The first time I went there, it was actually held up on short legs, so it was actually, the water was underneath it. So that tells you how much the beach has eroded in just 70 years or so. Since then, they have done beach replenishment, and it is now lying on the sand again, and the beach is actually going out quite a few feet more. It is closed off. You can't go in it. You can't go under it. Down the road from that, and across the bay in Delaware as well, are World War II watchtowers. There is only one left standing in New Jersey, but there's about like 12 to 20 or so in Cape Henlopen in Delaware. And obviously they had these watchtowers because of the threat of U-boats off the shore.
Well, they came into Cape May. I was going to Cape May for a long time, and the U-boat guys used to come into Cape May and party in Cape May. At least that was what they used to tell you that.
The German U-boats used to come in and party?
Yes. Well, no, yeah,
I'm not sure that was following orders.
I was naive about the kid here, but I wasn't naive about the fact that when I was young, you could walk in that bunker, and all the munitions were in there, and all the things that could explode were there, and they didn't stop people from going in. Now that must be under sand, or did they take that away?
The bunker is completely sealed off now. That's every angle you can't get in. And there's also signs everywhere you can't climb on it. They don't want you near it. Jersey. All right, so we have the World War II relics. World War I, off the coast of Sunset Beach, there is the remains of a prototype experimental concrete ship called the SS Atlantis. And the military learned the hard way that concrete's not the best thing to make ships out of. So it transported troops back home after World War I, and then they planned on using it as a ferry between Cape May and Lewes. Trouble is, it broke from its moorings during a storm, and because it's concrete, it got stuck and they couldn't dig it out. So it just sat off the shore for years and years and years. And back in the 60s and 70s, people could actually swim out to it, people jumped off of it, there were advertisements on the side of it, but over time, the ship actually broke in half, and only during low tide now you can see a tiny bit of it jutting out of the water. So it is quickly sinking. They say in a few more years you probably won't be able to see it anymore. But it also has caused a phenomenon known as Cape May diamonds. From the Delaware River, quartz and other minerals wash down, and the remains of the ship act as a trap, and they wash up polished on Sunset Beach. So there were all kinds of stories that there was a ship with jewelry on it that wrecked off the coast. It's just quartz. And it seems to me that they're getting a little bit harder to find. I don't know if it's from, relic hunters or maybe just because the ship is quickly disappearing. But if you do look among the pebbles on the beach, you can find some polished Cape May diamonds still. And when I went there last year, my daughter and I found a couple. So that was nice to share that with her. Anything else in particular? Any other questions about anything? Any other specific sites we'd like to talk about?
So what was the whole point of you writing this book? To bring attention to the sites that are no longer there, or why?
Well, let's take a step back for a second. I have been to roughly 400 sites in about 19 or 20 states. The purpose is, again, to just let people know that this is there, let people know that this was important to somebody at some time, and there may not be anybody around to tell that story anymore. Like Rosh Gap, a ghost town that I had to hike, I think it was 3¼ miles in, and when you see a black bear on the trail, you're like, oh boy. But he didn't bother me, I didn't bother him. But when you get there and you realize people lived here, people worked here, there's a cemetery just off the Appalachian Trail and only 3 gravestones remain, and one is so badly worn that it basically just looks like a stump at this point. These people are forgotten. Nobody is there to say anything for them. So I guess part of why I do this is to show that these people had a hard life, and we drive by every day, we go on the roads, never really look and see what's in the woods, what's over there. Up in Luzerne County, for example, I happen to notice a gravestone of a German woman just off a main road, and people drive by it every day. Well, that's somebody's life, that's somebody's story, and it's just time has moved on, everybody has forgotten it. Margaret Dillinger was the name, that's right. And it is a stone written in German, which is pretty interesting in the middle of the Poconos, I thought. But that's somebody's livelihood. Somebody was born, raised, and died within that area, and that's all that's left of them. So I believe some of this is worth preserving, worth remembering. And I don't spend too much time on it. The word ghost town seems to confuse a lot of people because people are like, oh, that must mean it's haunted. A ghost town is simply an empty town that nobody's in anymore. Ghost stories itself, sometimes they're interesting, sometimes they're fun to tell, but sometimes they have a tiny actual bit of truth in them. But if I can help it, I try to avoid those. I try to avoid the legends because sometimes the interesting stories and the actual truth behind the place are two very, very different beings.
Just two more questions, if I might. As a result of your writing this book, have you been contacted by any perhaps past descendants of any of the inhabitants or the companies that might have been there or any of that type of thing?
For these, no. From other places that I have visited, once or twice I've had people say, so-and-so was my ancestor. So it's interesting to hear about that, but I don't get too many of those. But it has happened a few times.
Have you ever, did you have any involvement with any of the books in Philadelphia, abandoned Philadelphia? There's been some really wonderful books on abandoned buildings in Philadelphia. Have you ever read any of them, seen any of them?
Are those with the same publisher, do you know? Because I'm not familiar.
I know the one, and I don't know the author, I know he's written two, but it's a lot of factories in Philadelphia, just some wonderful.
Those ones in particular I don't know about, but there was one gentleman, Regalsville, Pennsylvania. Pastor Jeff wrote Ghosts in the Ville and More Ghosts in the Ville. I had some contact with him, and he actually gave me a tour of a few of the places in Regalsville. But otherwise, no, I haven't heard of the Philadelphia books. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a standout?
I'm sorry, what?
A standout place that you think of more than the others?
Whew. I would have to say Rosh Gap, because it is utterly isolated. It's not that far from Harrisburg. It's not far from, and I can't think of, there's a big military site out there. When I was walking out, I could hear them testing munitions. But it's called St. Anthony's Wilderness, and it's a 3¼ mile hike in, and there's an old well, there's the remains of bridges, houses. Part of it runs along the Appalachian Trail, like I said earlier. And the cemetery, just seeing that again, I believe there's only 3 stones that have any inscription on them at this point. The 2 gentlemen were from England that are buried in there. There was, the child was maybe 1 year old. Just the isolation, the difficulty getting there, staring down a bear, that kind of stays with you. That one in particular was one of my favorite sites in eastern Pennsylvania, and I hiked out there 3 or 4 times, and I was really, really hoping to get back there last year, but it couldn't happen in my schedule. It was one thing when I lived an hour and a half away, but I would really like to go out and do that hike again. Absolutely. Concrete City would be another one too, because I don't know if anyone here has been to Nanticoke, but Nanticoke is a fairly large town in Luzerne County. The community college is just a few blocks away, and they're in a horseshoe pattern. There's just these houses sitting in the woods, and they're bizarre because they're made out of concrete. They all look exactly the same, and these are the ones that were built to house the railroad workers up there. They had concrete outhouses. Everything was made of concrete, and you're just like, why? That doesn't make sense, because they hold so much moisture, and just walking into them now, you can just feel it in the air. So it's just one of those places where time has moved on around it, and it's just sitting there, and they don't know what to do with it. The fire department used to run tests on it. They even tried to blow one of them up with dynamite, and it barely did any damage. So the town doesn't know what to do with them. It is a historical site, but they don't know what to do. Some people consider it an eyesore. Some people want it to be preserved. There is a marker for it, but it's one of those markers that's out on the main road and is nowhere near the actual site. So if you're like, oh, it's near here, no, it's not. So it's one of those confusing ones where like, ugh. I've had that happen a few times. Closer to here, a couple years ago, and again, I was contacted by the media for this one, Duffy's Cut. which, okay, so some of us know about that. When I first discovered it, or I can't say discovered it, I never actually went there, I saw the historical sign for it and I started doing research, but they had just started doing their archaeological digs, so nobody could get close to it at the point. But that was when they started discovering, hey, maybe what we were told isn't exactly what happened. And if you don't know the story of Duffy's Cut, several, and I mean dozens of Irish immigrant workers were buried in a cemetery, and it was, the story given was they died of consumption, they died of cholera, but when they started excavating these graves, there's wounds, there's bullet holes. So essentially these workers were murdered and then thrown in these graves, and then they built the railroad tracks over the cemetery to forget them. They didn't want them remembered. They wanted to cover this up. So they hired a whole new crew and just worked over them. And just in recent years, I mean, they're still digging at the site, I believe. They're realizing something else happened there. So that's another reason that I look into some of these sites, because sometimes what we are told isn't necessarily how it actually went down.
Ryan?
Yes, ma'am.
In your book, these places, do you tell people how to get there?
Yes, for the most part. For the most part. There is the cemetery I mentioned earlier. I had to swear to secrecy, do not give directions, and to be honest, without my GPS, I couldn't find it myself. But for the most part, yes, I do tell you how to get to them. And some of them, the graves of Washington soldiers at Washington's Crossing, and some of these are in county parks, state parks, so they are free for anybody to go see anyway. But some of them are a little more off the beaten path. Again, like Rosh Gap, which I've mentioned a few times now. You gotta drive down this twisty road, and you have to park in this specific lot in state game lands, and then you have to hike 3¼ miles in. You're never gonna find that unless you know where you're going. And that is another question, I guess. How do I find a lot of these places? Sometimes other people have shown them to me. The one disaster site that I mentioned earlier, I found by pure luck. I was told it was around this area, and I pull up and there's a mine reclamation site, big sign on the tree, like, okay, it's gotta be here somewhere. Not this trail, not this trail. Oh, here we go. So that one was purely by chance. And some of the sites, not so much recently, but I'd say about 10 years ago, if anybody has ever heard of a game known as geocaching. And if you're not sure what that is, a quick recap, it's basically high-tech hide and seek. People go out and hide, it can be ammo boxes, Tupperware containers. They hide little stashes, and they can be in the woods, they can be on the guardrail outside, they can be anywhere. When I first started exploring the Pine Barrens and when I first moved to the Poconos, I relied on geocaching quite a bit because other people who knew about these historic sites would place caches nearby some of these sites. Lausanne, a forgotten town near modern-day Nesquehoning and Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. It's actually between the two. I would have never known about that if there wasn't a geocache set there. But the way it was set up was it made me hike to one end of the town, and then I had to hike back a couple miles to the other end, or the proper center of town, where the post office and the hotel was. But on the way, I had to cross the sites of 2 old bridges that are no longer there, so I got wet. And then there was a cable bridge I had to cross because I can't think of the university now. They were doing an archaeological dig further down the river, so they made this cable bridge to get across the river there. So it was interesting bumping into them. They told me all kinds of facts about the Native American tribe, which again, at the moment I couldn't tell you which one specifically it was. And then when I asked them about the ruins of the town, I got conflicting stories. Some of the buildings I was told were just houses. Some said that they were there to store gunpowder. So even among the university workers, they really weren't sure what the buildings further away from the town were for. So that was a fun little adventure that I probably would have never been able to locate this town if it weren't for somebody placing an ammo box there. I thought I saw another hand.
Oh, I was going to ask you how to spell the R word. I couldn't catch it, and I was gonna write it down.
Oh, Rauschgap? R-A-U-S-C-H. Rauschgap.
Oh, gosh,
Rauschgap, yes ma'am. Supposedly there's two different ways in. The one I believe was only like 3/4 of a mile, but you basically need 4x4 or a lifted truck. I tried taking a Yaris down that road. That was not a good idea. So we ended up hiking in the long way, and that was the way I knew. That's what I stuck with. Plus I like to walk. Yes ma'am.
Are any of the other sites you talk about in your book near this area?
There are a few sites that I didn't include that would be considered close to here. I cannot think of the name of the fort at the moment, the one in Philadelphia. Fort Mifflin. That was one, and the only reason I did not include that was because it had an admission fee. So I tried to keep the sites places that were free to see. That one I really, really thought about putting in and decided against it. That was one of the more interesting ones, especially when I went there. There was a guy in the basement trying to record ghosts or something. I don't know. He had all this equipment with him. I'm like, all right, I'll let you do your thing. And again, Duffy's Cut's not too far from here, but the only thing I have from that is just a picture of the historical sign. I actually haven't seen the site itself.
How do you,
I'm sorry, what was that?
It's on private property. We had the gentleman who did Duffy's Cut here.
Okay.
Two twin brothers that, the twin that was born first kept interrupting his brother, and the whole presentation drove me nuts. But, you know, we want to say, come on. But anyway, they said it's on private property. They wouldn't tell anybody where it is because it's been subdivided and they didn't want people to change it to people's yard. But it's down near Immaculata College.
Okay. And again, the only thing I ever saw was the sign out by the one road there. I didn't have much time in the area, so I was just trying to snoop around a little bit. And that picture I took of the sign, a local news station actually asked me to use that in an article. And I wish I could remember which one, but that was when they really started investigating the whole history of it. I'm sorry, what?
how do you choose your sites? I mean, there's so many abandoned buildings around. I mean, around here, there's old ferries that ran across the rivers. There's mill houses all over the place. There's spring houses. I mean, what's your criteria for picking an abandoned spot?
Geographical is one thing. I tried to have as much from northeast Pennsylvania and from a little bit out west and down in this area. I tried to make it a mixed bag because I lived in Luzerne County for 8 years, so most of what I had was from up there, so I tried to balance it out. I think about safety as well. Is it legal? Are you allowed to be there? And I'm not going to say one way or the other, but when I was younger, I didn't really think about these things. But now that I have, you know, a teaching license and 2 little girls, like, maybe not. So again, geographical, the safety, are you actually allowed to be there? Because some are on private grounds, but the owners give you permission or you have to request it. One place that is mentioned in the book, Celestia, up in, Sullivan County, I believe. So it's up there a bit. you actually have to request permission from the Historical Society to even go on the grounds. And it was a town built by an offshoot of a Christian group, and I can't think of their name at the moment, but they prophesized that Jesus was going to return and live with them in this town in the middle of Pennsylvania. They even built a house for him on the blueprints. They built a house for him in the middle of the town. Trouble is, they requested draft exemption status during the Civil War, because they said this is a religious town and we are conscientious objectors, and President Lincoln granted it. Well, then all the draft dodgers started showing up. So the town quickly got filled up with people who didn't believe. They were just trying to get out of going to war. And then the date came when he was supposed to, resurrect and go to this town and live with them, and he didn't. So a lot of the believers started to lose faith. They started to move away. So long story short, all that is left of this town is a single wall. The buildings are all gone. There is just this single wall in this little part of, I believe the town's called LaPorte now, LaPorte, Pennsylvania. So again, that one, there's really nothing left, but the story behind it is just fascinating. So that is another reason that I include some of these sites. It can be what's there. Like seeing Concrete City is impressive. You have several of these buildings around you in this horseshoe shape. And then you go to Celestia, there's an empty field. You can see a few cellar holes, and there is, from what I saw anyway, and there may be more, but I don't believe so, there's a single wall. But the story behind it, why it was there, I thought it was just a fascinating story that this town came and went for the reasons that it did. Sure.
What's the oldest site that you've included or been to? I mean, do Native American structures interest you, or is it really just...
I don't believe there's anything that old. I would be very interested in seeing things like that. I know somewhere in northern Jersey, along one of the rivers, there's actually paintings and rock carvings along, I can't remember which river. I've never been there, but I would be interested. I just wasn't aware of any. But yeah, I don't have any.
What's the oldest other than Native American?
Probably American Revolution, maybe colonial era. Again, we have Washington's Crossing, the soldiers that died before the famous crossing of the Delaware. We always see the paintings. He's standing on the front of the boat like this, and they're rowing behind him. It probably didn't happen like that. But a lot of the men actually died before they even crossed. So if you go to Washington's Crossing, it's not really secret, but they really don't blatantly, make a big deal out of it. There's a line of, I believe, 13 graves, and all but the captain were unidentified. So they just say unknown soldier, and the captain is buried in the middle. Some of the other sites too deal with the American Revolution, especially in Luzerne County and that area. You have the story behind Queen Esther's Rock, where a half Native American woman, her son is killed when the frontiersmen are fighting against the tribes and the British. And there is this rock, it has a barrier over it, and supposedly she kidnapped several colonial men and smashed their heads on this rock. There is also a grave of a few American soldiers right behind some guy's house. It's not on private property, it's actually in between two houses. There's a little trail, but these guys were ambushed by the British, and it was a massacre. They were slaughtered in the woods. And so there is just this monument to a little-known American Revolution skirmish. So we get told about Yorktown, we get told about Saratoga, but the frontier at Northeast Pennsylvania was the frontier at this time. There was a lot of fighting going on there that history books don't mention. And I think that if you're going to tell the story, you should tell the whole story. So just seeing this marker several feet off the road behind two houses, so how come more people don't know about that? How come it's back in the woods? Why aren't there signs saying, hey, this is here, go see that? It's there, you just got to know it's there.
Ryan, is Centralia in your book?
Oh yes, Centralia is, absolutely. Centralia, but there is so much hype. I'll get to you in a second, sorry. Centralia, there is so much hype behind it that a lot of people don't realize that there have been several other mine disasters in Pennsylvania. We talked about Knox Mine earlier, which is probably the most recent one and essentially killed mining in that part of the state. But there was also the Stockton mine disaster, which actually was just a few miles away from me when I lived up in the area. And with that one, there was no fire. The mine simply just opened up like a sinkhole. The surrounding houses just went in, and people were in the houses, and they were unable to save them. When they tried to get into the sinkhole to try and dig these people out, the gap just kept widening, so they had to give up on it. What's the other one? Not Knox. Avondale. The problem with the Avondale mine was, and this actually caused the state and other parts of the country to make mining regulations, there was one entrance and one exit. So the way in was also the way out. So they lowered the men in, they're working in the mine. Well, I forget how, but the chute caught fire up at the top. So the men are trapped inside. There is no other escape. Again, the way in is the way out. So they are trapped down there, and I forget the exact number right now, but several dozen people died in this disaster, and it wasn't the fire that killed them. They were asphyxiated because it burned up all the oxygen. So that one disaster caused regulations. You must have, multiple exits, multiple entrances. But yeah, Centralia was another one I tried to compare. I believe the first time I visited Centralia was 2002, 2003. And the last time I went was, again, just about a year ago. And the difference was staggering. I'm sure we've all heard of Highway to Hell, the old Highway 61. The ground was ripped open, the smoke was pouring out, and that's a smell you never forget. And being in other parts of Pennsylvania, Carbondale especially, there were 3 fires going under one town in Pennsylvania. Most of them were contained, but we were going through one time and I smelled that smell, and it's something you don't forget. But anyway, Centralia, roads ripped open, smoke's pouring out. People say the snow never sticks there because the ground's so hot that it melts away. So it was really strange to me when I went back last year, that old portion of the highway it's not ripped open anymore, it's not bucking up. They actually went in and flattened it, but now it is completely, every square inch of it is covered in graffiti. So it's no longer the Highway to Hell, now it's the graffiti highway. And within the town itself, I didn't see a single spot where there was smoke coming out of the ground. So they are trying to plug those up, but it also seems like the fire itself is moving on. Some people said that it will take several thousand years for the fire to burn out, but it is also moving toward the town of Ashland, which is right next to Centralia. And they have tried to contain it. They have pumped, I don't know how much water. They can't stop it. So it's basically a lost cause at this point. And I believe most of us know this already. Centralia was stripped of its zip code, so technically it's not even a town anymore. And there are very few people left living there. One more mine disaster, Laurel Run, which is actually not too far from Wilkes-Barre or Whitehaven. That's another one I went back to last year, and you really can't see smoke anymore. You really don't smell it. But there was a town, there was the town Laurel Run, and there used to be a lot of debris from it because they went in and demolished all the houses. At the very end of the road, I think that there's like a small community, but otherwise the sides of the road are bare now. And that's another one that they have contained. They say it might be out by now, but when I went there last year, there was really no evidence of it still burning. The vents are all still there. You don't see the smoke coming out. You don't smell the smell anymore. But yeah, that's, I think I discussed 4 or 5 different mine disaster sites. I'm sorry, we've been waiting on you for a while, sorry.
Have you done any research in Michigan?
I've actually never been to Michigan. I would like to go because I do have a few friends out there.
After, I'll tell you an interesting story.
Cool. Cool, thank you.
I won't bore the group,
I'm sure nobody's, but you better not be bored.
How about Salem, New Jersey? Have you been around that area? I have, I'm a descendant of the Worcester family, and the Worcester Glass Works was outside of Salem, which was a pre-revolutionary glass works.
Salem. I believe I have a few sites from there. Isn't that where the tea burning was? Is that Greenwich?
Greenwich, yeah.
Right county, wrong county? I think that's it.
I don't know about the tea burning, but there's
No, that might be Cumberland.
1690 houses down there in the Salem area, and my ancestor in 1728 or something like that started one of the first glass works in the country. And the site is marked, but it's not really known exactly where it was, so there's a site marker for it.
I believe that's Fort Mott. Is that Salem?
Yeah, Salem is Salem, so I don't really, more than that, I don't know the area. I went down there, and they've got a great historic center down there.
I think Fort Mott is on the coast of Salem County. If that's true, there's also Finns Point Cemetery, which is one of a handful of cemeteries in the country that have both Union and Confederate soldiers buried in the same cemetery. It was also one of the sites where the serial killer who killed, what was it, Versace, I think, he hid out in the cemetery there. Yeah, there's a dark story to that cemetery as well.
Where would that be?
Finns Point Cemetery is right next to Fort Mott. And again, there is a small section of the cemetery dedicated to Confederate soldiers. And it's one of the very few cemeteries in the whole country that have both Union and Confederate soldiers in the same cemetery.
We have time for one more question. Ryan?
Yes, ma'am.
If you're around tomorrow, you can visit our abandoned cemetery that's right up the street.
I appreciate that. I'm heading back home tomorrow. My school finished up. I don't even remember the date at this point because I've been up here for 9 days now. I had a signing at a Barnes & Noble last Sunday, and I was basically just hanging around for tonight.
Ryan, thank you so much.
Oh,
Ryan's book, Abandoned or Forgotten, Overlooked Corners of Eastern Pennsylvania. And also, this summer at Radnor Memorial Library, we're having what we're calling the Real Life film series. And 2 of those films witness Pennsylvania's industrial past. And we're going to start with the movie The Cut, which is an hour-long movie about Duffy's Cut. If you're interested, just look on your summer program. And then I think the following month we're going to do Centralia, which is the hour-long movie about Centralia. And I sure hope to see all of you then. Thank you all for coming. Brian, thank you for coming all this way. Main Point Books, Studio 21, Tom, Radnor Historical Society. Thank you. See you next time.